Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for tuning in to today's BECC webinar. I'm thrilled about today's speakers, and I'm very excited that you all could be here to join us today. You'll hear from our speaker in just a moment, but before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how we all got here and what is bringing us to this session today. So my name is Ruben Sussman. I direct the Behavior and Human Dimensions program at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, which if you want to be more efficient about it, you might call it ACEEE. In my capacity here at ACEEE, I also co-chair the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference, and I organize these webinars. So thanks so much for indulging me and of course the webinar, the conference itself. So before we get started, I do need to bring your attention to the fact that the early bird rates for the conference are going up after July 31st. So that's in just 2 days or 3 days, depending on how you count it, on Saturday. So be sure if you're going to register now, because prices are going to go up. And the full agenda is out now. So you have something you can check out while you are on your way to learning about the conference and registering. So register now, and if you like the kind of content we have here or that you've seen in other webinars, you'll love the virtual conference. Also, we need to extend a special thank you to all our conference sponsors. Without them, the conference wouldn't be possible, but also this webinar wouldn't be possible. So thank you so much to our sponsors. And if you or yourself are a sponsor and you want to get your logo up in front of dozens or hundreds of people in some cases during these webinars and the conference, please get in touch with me and let me know. All right, so Zoom tips. I'm sure that by now all of you are well familiar with Zoom because of the pandemic and whatnot, but in case you aren't, don't hit that microphone button. Please try to remain muted for the entire session, but we love seeing your webcam. So if you feel inclined, you may turn on your webcam and see everybody else. And along those same lines, this is a very sort of interactive session. For today's webinar, we've decided to use Zoom Meeting, which allows you to see everybody else who's here, to chat with them. And there isn't even a private Q&A box. I'll be watching the chat for your questions and your ongoing discussions. So let me know what you're thinking as our speaker is talking. And we'll have plenty of time for your questions at the end of the presentation. Feel free to submit them as we go through, and I will try to make a note of what's going on in the chat in terms of questions and discussion. We can bring that up at the end. So with that out of the way, I also wanted to give a plug for our next webinar coming up, very exciting. On August 31st, we'll have Dr. Sabrina McCormick talking about how climate storytelling can change our world. And what's so exciting about Sabrina is like this fascinating character who not only has been published in like big name journals like Science and Nature Climate Change, she's also a producer in an Emmy Award-winning TV series. So I'll be very excited and interested to hear what she has to say next month. But without further ado, I want to introduce today's webinar, Reimagining Environmental Justice with Dr. Margot Brown. Margot is the Associate Vice President of Environmental Justice and Equity Initiatives at the Environmental Defense Fund. And what she does in that area can really help the rest of us in applying these sort of principles to what we do. So I'm going to turn it over now to Margot. Thanks for being here. And Margot, you're still muted, so hit that mute button. There we go. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. I hope that today's presentation sheds some light on how we're thinking about environmental justice here at EDF and just the big green space in general, as well as provides the opportunity for some discussion. I have lots of thoughts about how to approach this, but I also know that there's a lot that I can learn, and I'd welcome the opportunity to learn about how you're thinking about this. If you have any thoughts based on your expertise around things that I should incorporate or consider into my work, I would greatly appreciate that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started and share my screen. Ruben, can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see the screen so that okay, perfect.
It's looking great.
Great. All right. So this afternoon, I've been asked to talk about how we're thinking about environmental justice. And when I say environmental justice, I should say more justice and equity, because at EDF, we're addressing environmental justice as well as climate justice. So the presentation today, I'd like to go over three key areas that all sort of flow into one another. The first is my own personal story around climate justice, and that starts with Hurricane Katrina. Then I'd like to talk just a little bit about the importance of the role of social determinants of health that are often overlooked when we talk about climate justice or environmental justice, and then how those two experiences have shaped the work that I'm doing now at EDF and reimagining equity and environmental justice. So here you have two images of New Orleans, Louisiana. The one on the left is the Superdome the days immediately following Hurricane Katrina. And the image on the right is a Whole Foods grocery store that I shopped at frequently as a graduate student. So in 2005, I was living in New Orleans. I was a graduate student at Tulane University working on my doctorate, my doctoral degree. And the research that I was doing at the time was around environmental justice in Louisiana's industrial corridor. And that research and Hurricane Katrina forever shaped my experiences around climate justice and how I view climate justice. As we all know, the climate crisis punishes disadvantaged communities in many ways. And in the case of Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans, the devastation to the communities of color and low-income communities was so severe that it put all of these disadvantages in sharp focus for the entire world to see. A few days before Hurricane Katrina made landfall, I evacuated New Orleans. And 7 months later, when I returned to defend my dissertation, vast swaths of the city were still closed. Entire neighborhoods were still devastated and in disrepair. However, the uptown Whole Foods market looked exactly the same as it did a few days before the storm. So the storm landed on a Monday, and a week prior when I did my grocery shopping, I'd gone to the Whole Foods in New Orleans uptown area, and I got all my food for the week and left a few days later and didn't return. And when I did return to defend my dissertation, almost everything in the city was closed. And my advisor was having a celebration because I had successfully defended my dissertation in her house. And I thought it'd be really nice to bring some flowers. Well, I was like, where am I gonna get flowers? And everything was closed. And someone said, oh, Whole Foods Uptown has got them. So I went up to the Whole Foods and it looked exactly the same as it did the week before Hurricane Katrina. Nothing was unchanged in the store. I mean, there were some houses around the neighborhood or some houses around the store that were being renovated or repaired. But for the most part, it looked exactly the same. And part of the reason why this store looked exactly the same was, first of all, it was situated on higher ground. And that was intentional because this was an area in the city where people had the economic resources to rebuild following the storm. So their grocery stores intact, their communities intact, several months after the storm. And just a few miles away in the lower Ninth Ward, 16 years after Hurricane Katrina, many vacant houses today still have the vacant notices pinned on the front door. Those who lived in the Ninth Ward, who once owned their homes, couldn't or didn't come back because they lacked the required resources to rebuild. This Black low-income community was flooded by an industrial canal that was built in the 1950s. And the reason why the canal was built was to shorten the distance for commercial shipping. And the canal's very construction wiped out the protective natural barriers that existed uptown, but were removed in the lower Ninth Ward and exposed residents to hazardous exhaust from industry for decades before Hurricane Katrina. And this act eventually destroyed their community. So now I'd like to share with you some images from the lower ninth ward to give you a better perspective on how great the devastation was. I know that a number of you are probably familiar with what happened in New Orleans in the lower ninth ward, but this is a really specific case study here. If you look here, you can see houses along Jordan Avenue. These houses were about 150 feet from where the levee broke. And what these images will show you is that it's a sort of an evolution over time of what has happened in New Orleans, specifically in the lower ninth ward. And this is what the community looked like a year before Hurricane Katrina. So a little bit of background on the lower ninth ward. It was one of the poorest areas in the city. The average household income in the lower ninth ward was about $28,000. However, the predominantly African-American neighborhood had an unusually high ownership rate of about 59%. This is really important to keep in mind because this community was incredibly unique. While it was low in income, it had an incredibly rich history and a number of people who had lived in the neighborhood for generations because they were homeowners. This community itself is physically split from the rest of New Orleans by the industrial canal that I just referenced. So this is what the lower ninth ward looked like immediately following Hurricane Katrina. The levee had been overtopped 40 years earlier by Hurricane BECC, which had killed 75 people. And some of the vacant lots seen in this image are the remnants from that storm. The storm surge from Katrina caused the levees along the industrial canal to be overtopped by as much as 5 feet. And at 7:30 a.m., the levees failed in 2 locations. And you can see from this image right here on Jordan Avenue, the failure of the levee. So it's down at the very bottom center part of the screen. And this southern breach in this composite image taken 11 days after the levees broke was 900 feet long. And the water entered this neighborhood with enough speed and force to push houses eastward off of their foundation. So if you can see in the upper portion of this slide, you see a lot of houses that are way, they're sort of stacked on top of one another. And that was because of the sheer force of water when the levees broke. And there was an empty barge that was drawn through the breach and it settled along Jordan Romaine Street. So you can see that in the bottom right-hand corner. It's sort of that red bar there. And just 3 weeks after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Rita arrived. And this area was inundated with water again for about 5 weeks. So fast forward to 2010. And one of the major hindrances of rebuilding in the lower ninth ward was the financial assistance that was offered to residents. And it did not cover, it only covered the market value of the homes, which was typically a third of the cost to rebuild the homes. Remember, I said this is a predominantly African-American, low-income community. Many of these people were unable to get flood insurance, or if they did, they were not fully insured to be able to rebuild their home. And so the cost to rebuild was astronomical, and a lot of people opted not to do so. There were a handful of folks who did decide to rebuild, and a number of them worked with Brad Pitt's Make It Right Foundation. And that was a major driver for assistance in rebuilding. Unfortunately, this program fell apart very shortly after it started. And it's created a host of additional and unintentional consequences for the residents of the lower ninth ward. This is the lower ninth ward in 2014. And while much of New Orleans has regained its pre-Katrina population, less than half of the lower ninth ward has returned. There are sort of rising numbers of people in the lower ninth ward, but it is still not nearly. In 2019, I had the opportunity to return to New Orleans and specifically to the lower Ninth Ward. And as I said when I started this presentation, there are many, many homes within the lower Ninth Ward that still have like a FEMA posting on the door that's obviously very faded because it's been there for the last 16 years. And those homeowners and residents chose not to return. So one of the key takeaways from this presentation that I want you to remember today is where and how we build our communities impacts human health and our land, air, and water. And the way that I try to think about this is the social determinants of health. It is not a typical framework that is often used in the environmental space. And I think that is in part because I do have a background in public health and have a profound and deep understanding for the social determinants of health. If we take the individual who sits at the center here, we can use a person from a former resident of the lower Ninth Ward. As I stated at the beginning of this presentation, folks who lived in the lower Ninth Ward did not have high levels of economic stability. Most of the people who worked or lived in the lower Ninth Ward were members of the service industry in New Orleans. So that storm hit probably a few days before payday. And many of the folks in this community lived paycheck to paycheck. So their economic stability was diminished greatly. And that's why you had so many people at the Superdome. In addition to that, there were a number of people who lived in that community who had a host of pre-existing health conditions. Their access to food was not what it was uptown. There was no Whole Foods that was built on higher ground. There was, I think it's 70% of the original inhabitants in the lower Ninth Ward had 70% did not have a high school education. And the neighborhood and physical environment was greatly diminished because of the canal. The one thing that the lower Ninth Ward had going for it was the community and social context. They had a tremendous sense of pride in their community, and they were a very tight-knit community. However, after Hurricane Katrina, with all the different forces at play, as you could see from the images that I just showed you, that community was annihilated. And while many have returned, I won't say never, but it's highly unlikely that it will be the place that it once was. And when we begin to think about climate justice, we need to think about the lower Ninth Ward. We need to think about the larger picture of an equity. We cannot just think about the environment, because it is all the social determinants that will have a profound impact in our ability to address the climate crisis. So what I'd like to do right now is transition to how I'm reimagining justice and equity at the Environmental Defense Fund and our approach for really thinking about how best to use the elements of the social determinants of health in our work. So I'd like to share a really powerful quote with you that it's part of our vision and principles. So in May of this year, EDF's Environmental Justice Council released a set of vision and principles. And these vision and principles are really the guiding force for how EDF will move forward as we begin to approach environmental justice. What you should know is that EDF does not have the best history when it comes to environmental justice. We, as an organization, have sort of had our day of reckoning and realized that we have lived within and benefited from systems that provided EDF opportunities that were not afforded to others. We have also been consistently intentional in, we've been inconsistently intentional in addressing the disproportionate environmental burden borne by marginalized communities, especially communities of color. And many times in our history, the policy stances that we took, the actions that we have taken were at direct odds with local needs and priorities. And what we learned from our EJ partners is we really need to think about co-creating and working to develop community-led solutions if we are fully going to address the climate crisis that we are in. So the three major areas of our vision and principles are taking a public stance and committing to becoming more authentic partners with EJ and frontline communities by, first of all, being transparent, being open about our agenda and what our objectives are. The next thing we need to do is begin to open doors to broaden access to donors and grant makers. EDF is a $250 million a year enterprise, and we have tremendous access to donors and grant makers that enable us to do the work that we are doing. We're also needing to learn how to stand with the communities that are most affected by pollution. And one of the things that we are doing as a first step is looking inward to examine how our structure, strategy, and culture can better reflect the global community that we serve. So one of the first things that we've done in addition to the vision and principles is we've developed our own definition of environmental justice. And there are two key words that when we think about environmental justice, and it's remedying and preventing. And so our goal now is to remedy environmental harms that have been purposefully or incidentally imposed on specific communities and prevent similar injustices from happening in the future. While this sentence is pretty clear and simple, the task of completing this work will be Herculean. As a result, I've developed an environmental justice strategy to uphold our vision and principles and to uphold how we're defining environmental justice. So I'm fairly new to EDF. I arrived about 8 months ago, and in a period of about 5 months, I met with between 200 and 300 people. And if you saw my Outlook calendar, you would recognize that this is not an exaggeration. I met with a host of environmental justice leaders. I met with a ton of people from frontline communities. I met with a number of former federal colleagues. I came from the EPA's Office of Children's Health Protection. I've also have a strong background in academia, so I met with a lot of my academic colleagues. I've met with a ton of EDF staff, a number of our donors, and folks from our trustees. And with all of these conversations, what they did is they provided the foundation for the strategy you see here. And this strategy that I'm developing is going to be done in concert with environmental justice leaders. We're setting up an environmental justice advisory committee. This is something that EDF has never done. So as part of our strategy to address climate and environmental justice, we want to hear from the folks who are most impacted by climate and environmental justice. We are also working with our staff and those individuals who have expertise and lived experience at EDF and addressing climate and environmental justice. And the real plan here is to enable EDF to confront the pre-existing tensions with the environmental justice community and learn how to create global environmental solutions that are formed by environmental justice and frontline communities. And this effort is definitely not going to be easy. However, the potential benefits to solve our climate crisis are tremendous, in part because some of the immediate co-benefits, such as improved local air quality, may be more powerful politically than the longer-term climate benefits. The overall goal of this strategy is to establish a durable and comprehensive environmental justice approach that is integrated into EDF's work around the globe and strengthens EDF's capacity to partner with environmental justice communities to create lasting change. And that change will be done through these four key areas. The first is readiness, and this is organizational readiness. This is training, developing shared organizational goals, and program accountability. And the hope is this will foster and sustain the needed capabilities in EDF to begin to address environmental justice in our work. The next element is partnerships. And with partnerships, what we're doing is establishing targeted and authentic partnerships with environmental justice organizations, policymakers, NGOs, and business leaders to implement more equitable and community-centered solutions. These partnerships can address the tensions and create more durable solutions by building and sustaining a culture of outreach and substantive engagement with environmental justice communities and other entities. And these partnerships must be based on a shared agenda and a common goal. This can no longer be EDF helicoptering in and telling these communities what we want them to do or how we want to partner with them, but this has to be a shared enterprise. The next element of the strategy is systemic change. And this is where we're advocating for legal or policy changes to address the underlying causes of environmental equity, and where we leverage EDF's core capabilities in science, economics, advocacy, and corporate partnerships. And we're really going to need to learn as an organization how to build solutions utilizing economic forces and scientific research to achieve both global outcomes and local environmental and equity outcomes for environmental justice and frontline communities. And I honestly believe that these needed benefits are not mutually exclusive. They can go hand in hand, but they must go hand in hand as we work together with environmental justice and frontline communities and organizations to do this work. The final element of our strategy is capacity building. And this is where we're hoping to provide access to technical, organizational, and financial resources to EJ advocates through the co-creation of an environmental justice community capacity center that has received a generous commitment of support to EJ communities and allowing them access to technical and financial resources. What we're hoping to do through this center is leverage EDF's technical expertise as well as our relationship with launch and sustain this effort to meet community-driven goals. And by building capacity, the center will ensure that EJ communities have more than a seat at the table. They will have the required technical and financial resources to fully engage in the policy-making process. Oftentimes, I hear so many of my colleagues say, well, we need to give the EJ community or frontline groups a seat at the table. And a seat at the table is the floor. When you invite someone over to your house for a meal, you don't just give them a seat at the table. You give them a plate, you give them a cup, you give them a fork, a knife, a spoon, and a napkin. And we need to be able to not only give or cede, I should say, it's not giving, it's ceding our power to EJ communities and frontline organizations. But in ceding that power, making sure that they are equipped with the adequate resources needed to fully engage in policy and advocacy and decision-making. So how do we get there? This is what I've just described is a massive undertaking. I don't want to pretend that this is going to take place overnight. This is at least a 5-year process here at EDF. And one of the first things that I'm advocating for, and I've already started building out, is staff training. And I'm literally calling it boot camp. And this is where our staff, not all staff, but about 40 to, I'd say 30 to 40 folks who are in a mid-level or mid-career range. These are people who are senior managers or directors at EDF, will be required, will be asked to sign up for the boot camp. In order to join the boot camp, they will have to come with an environmental justice or climate justice problem in hand that they are actively working on. And the goal is to work with these folks over the period of a year on their specific topic. So for 1 week, they will be engaged in a boot camp, and a boot camp that goes beyond learning about the history of environmental racism or learning about the history of environmental justice. a boot camp that requires individuals to work on their own personal trauma and to understand how that trauma plays out in their work. Another thing that you'll be asked to do as, or another thing that I say you, another thing our staff will be asked to do when they attend this boot camp is to learn how to become effective mediators. And not that they're mediating conversations, but it's imperative that they learn how to listen. So radical listening, appreciative inquiry, dealing with our own personal traumas are all the different things that will be rolled into this boot camp. And then we'll be working on all of these elements along with their projects that they're working on over a period of a year. And these 30 to 40 individuals will be broken down into pods where they will be learning and supporting one another. So this is a radical shift in training at EDF, because many of these individuals who are directors or are managers, they're the folks who work across the agency, across the organization, and they work from the top up and from the bottom down, because most of them are managing more junior roles, but they also have to interface with the AVPs, the vice presidents, and the senior vice presidents within the organization. So they're really going to be one of the first elements of catalytic change within EDF. Another area of focus is developing authentic partnerships. And I spoke a little bit about this, but I want to give you a couple examples of what I mean by authentic partnerships. One is the Hip Hop Caucus's Think 100%. And this is an incredible organization that stands for solutions and justice for those who are most harmed by the climate crisis. But the way in which they're doing this is incredibly innovative. Think 100% has an amazing podcast called The Coolest Show. They've recently done some films that have been shown at major film festivals across the United States. And, when they came to EDF to think about ways to partner with us, one of the things that, we said is, we can advertise your films, or we can advertise your podcast. Again, that sort of thing is very superficial, and that's not really a partnership. One of the things right now that the Hip Hop Caucus will be doing is working on climate education and voting in the Hampton Roads area in Virginia. And what EDF would like to do is support their efforts by providing sociologists to go down and do pre and post analyses on their process. So we're helping the Hip Hop Caucus to learn, if you're doing this engagement around voting and climate, what elements work, what elements don't work? How does that translate into the next time you do this work, instead of just, we'll promote your podcast on our Twitter feed? Again, it's getting beyond the superficial and getting into something much deeper. Another example is the University of Maryland has their Community Engagement, Environmental Justice, and Health Center that is led by Dr. Jacoby Wilson. And we have already started partnering with Dr. Jacoby Wilson on a number of different projects. What I recognize, and I think a handful of my colleagues at EDF recognize as well, is we lack the expertise and the lived experience to do the kind of community engagement and environmental justice research that's needed to move the field forward, like someone such as Dr. Wilson. So it's imperative that we support his research in a meaningful way. And we're supporting his research, not saying, hey, we think you should work on fill in the blank, but what are you working on? And how is what you're working on aligned with our goals? And is there something we can work on together that is aligned, where we have shared goals and priorities? And the final element is the Environmental Justice Community Capacity Center. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, this Community Capacity Center has received a generous gift already, and the center will be stood up at the Tides Foundation. Tides is an independent entity, so because of EDF's prior reputation, I and others here at the organization feel it would be wholly inappropriate for EDF to stand up an environmental justice capacity center. So this center will be co-created externally at the TAGS Foundation with a separate environmental justice advisory council. So we'll be setting up two advisory councils. One is our internal one and one is for the capacity center. And so this center will be built by and for the environmental justice community. As I mentioned earlier as well, we'll be looking at financial capacity, technical capacity, and organizational capacity. While what you see in front of you is a summation of those 250 odd conversations I had, but this is just based on conversation. This is not based on reality. And so what this center ends up being will likely change dramatically because once we bring in the folks who are actually on the front lines, dealing with environmental justice and dealing with climate justice, they may say, hey, EDF, what we really need is you to double down and get us as much technical, scientific assistance as you possibly can. Or they might say, we just need funds or some combination. So what you see here is just a very high level concept that will evolve over time. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I would welcome any questions that you have.
Margot, thank you so much for telling us about EJF's work and about how important it is for us to include equity and justice, environmental justice issues in our climate work. I think most of the folks on this call come at this from the climate perspective, and it's really important for this community to understand the importance of environmental justice. We're now going to open it up to anybody who has questions. You can always type in the chat and responding to questions or chatting. And we're also going to do something new, which is if you raise your hand, we can allow you to unmute yourself and simply ask the question as a human being, asking a question to another human being. So just to get things started, we do have a question from Colin Weigel, which I have to say, we're very fortunate to have him. He's going to be on one of the plenary sessions at BECC in November. Colin asks, he says, thanks for the great presentation, and do you have metrics that you prefer for defining communities with respect to environmental justice or for measuring progress towards environmental justice outcomes? For example, what metrics would you want to see in a visual display of health outcomes or pollutant exposure or small geographic scales? A lot of the folks on this call are into research and behavioral science. So that kind of question, I think, is important to the community. What do you think, Margot?
That is an excellent question, Colin, thank you. And this is one of the things that we're grappling with right now at EDF, because we really don't have any baseline. So, I mentioned readiness, and the first thing that I'm doing at EDF is we're right now in the process of conducting a landscape analysis survey and a vision and principles alignment survey. So those are two separate surveys where we're trying to get a baseline of some of these metrics in terms of health outcomes and pollutant exposure, specifically related to what we are working on in EDF. So this is very tight. This is not like the broader environmental justice sphere. This is how we're addressing environmental justice and equity at EDF. Because this is a new survey that hasn't been validated, the hope is that this initial survey will be used as a baseline, and next year we will begin to validate these questions to find out if what we're measuring or what we're looking at is what we should actually be doing. Again, Colin, this is going to take some time. I mean, I am really trying to manage expectations here at EDF. I keep telling my colleagues or saying to my colleagues, do you want me to do this now or do you want me to do it right? And right is going to take some time, and getting real metrics that are actually meaningful that allow us to make informed decisions will probably take us a couple years to get there.
Great, thank you. And we have a comment here from Rosie Sharp, who just says, it's fantastic programming. It's great to see deeper, longer term commitments like the year-long boot camp and practicum. Very interested, she's particularly interested in seeing the results of the program and how it might be used as a model for other orgs. And this leads me to actually a question that I had, which is, about organizational behavior. And I see that you've decided to use this boot camp for sort of champions within the organization, training people within the organization to become champions. Can you talk a little bit more about organizational behavior and how change happens? How is change happening at EDF, and how can other organizations, instigate the same kind of change?
Okay, that is a loaded question. I have a loaded answer. So give me just a second, because I want to just write down a few points. I'm a big note taker. So
Great, I like that. And just, I guess I got a direct question from Emily in the meantime while you're addressing that we will be sharing the slide deck and the recording of this webinar on our website and through direct email. So stay tuned for that. Glad to see that VEIC could use that information.
okay. So I want to, I'm a big storyteller, and I'm going to share a story with you. When I first applied for this position, I was at the Environmental Protection Agency, and I had been there for 4 years under the Trump administration, and it was a very challenging time professionally, given the administration's assault on the environment and climate change. And after George Floyd was murdered, I knew that I could no longer sit on the outside looking in around environmental justice and equity. And I wanted to do more with my career. And so I decided to look for other opportunities. And when I saw this position at EDF, I was like, holy cow, this is amazing. This does not align at all with EDF's reputation. And so I called someone who I had had an informational interview with years earlier and said, are you for real? Like, is this for real? And she said, yeah, no, we're for real. And I said, no, I mean, is senior management behind this? Is the board behind this? Or is this just a performative exercise? And she said, oh no, we are 100% behind this, and this is not a performative exercise. And I think 7 or 8 interviews later, I got the job. And my first week on the job, one of the things that had happened was EDF had received a $100 million gift from the Bezos Earth Fund. And a number of folks on the staff, especially some of the more junior folks, were really troubled by this gift, given the need for, I should say, the tremendous need by climate justice and environmental justice groups. And once again, a big green was receiving this money. And I was shocked to see the range of organizational behavior. Within the Environmental Justice Council, we have about 20 individuals who are incredibly dedicated to justice and equity. And they were the ones who drafted the vision and principles. And I have never seen behavior like this before in an organization. I've also never seen senior leadership to really listen to the more junior staff and give them the floor and the opportunity to create change. That the council was also largely responsible for the position I now hold. They advocated for the position, and at one point, EDF had an AVP of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And they were like, this is not enough. They are not the same thing. They are definitely related, but they are 2 different things, and you need 2 different roles. And they successfully lobbied for my position and my colleague's position, Rory Mohammed. As part of those vision and principles, the initial document that the Environmental Justice Council had created was so shocking to me. I could not believe that they put some of this stuff in writing. I mean, they were calling out colonization, they were calling out white supremacy. They were using phrases and language that I, as a Black woman, was shocked that others were using in a professional setting. And it's a really fascinating set of organizational behaviors that I'm seeing play out in front of me, Rosie, because you have a group of people who are so motivated and so activated, and leadership who's listening. Now, I think that if you talk to some folks internally, they would say, we're not moving fast enough and we still have a host of problems. And others who would say, we're hitting the mark, we've hired Margot, look what we're doing. But the organizational behavior is really a fascinating dynamic there, just because of the role that they have, or the, I guess it's not role, the space that they have ceded for more junior folks in the organization. And I also think that they've come to the realization EDF will be obsolete. We will be a dinosaur if we don't begin to lean in on climate and environmental justice. So there's a lot of amazing work that's going on with everybody on the council, as well as other people in the organization. And it's challenging in terms of behavior, because you have, the way that I've described EDF is like a third, and a third. So you've got 1/3 who's like the Environmental Justice Council, who's like, Bezos should give his money to the people who need it most, and we should be ceding power to power and funding to frontline organizations. And then you have other people who believe it, but are, I don't know if this is where we should be going. This seems to be maybe a bridge too far. And then you have another third who are on that path to getting there. They're really trying, but they're not quite there yet. And that's the group that I'm really trying to work with in this next year, with this sort of boot camp slash practicum experience, is really working with the folks who are on their way. I'm a big believer, again, I don't have a background in behavioral science or behavioral change, but I'm a big believer in bringing on the coalition of the willing. The example that I like to use is with my own children. I have 3. And if, one is having a temper tantrum, but the other 2 are sort of, one is gung-ho about what I've suggested, and the other one is kind of going along to get along. If we keep moving the train in the right direction, the one who is sort of like, I don't know about this, or is, having a full-on temper tantrum, will eventually pull it together and come along. I'd welcome your expertise on this sort of like behavioral model that I've observed as a parent, but I really believe that I have to work with the coalition of the willing. And my hope is that over time, those who are skeptical will begin to see the impact and the power of the work of their colleagues who have been brought into the fold, and that I will be able to turn these folks also into evangelists, and for them to be able to say, oh my gosh, look, I was working with this community and we've been trying to work with them for years, and now all of a sudden we have this incredible solution that I never thought we would have. And that's really the hope. So that was a very long-winded answer, Rosie, around talking about the sort of behavior that I see at EDF and how I'm trying to approach it.
And I have to say that as a behavioral scientist, I think that your intuition lines up nicely with the science behind that. The coalition of the willing, and demonstrating by getting a few folks on board is really probably a very good strategy. So thanks for sharing that. And actually, your answer kind of leads me to my next question. And if anybody else has any questions, please put them in the chat, and or raise your hand. But my next question was just, if we could just take a step back. I know you mentioned that how surprised you were that EDF is, starting this position and taking such strong language. What is it? What kind of policies were causing problems before, and why were some communities not interested in working with EDF? Could you just expand a little bit on the kinds of policies that EDF supported and why they damaged low-income communities or caused problems for low-income or communities of color?
I'd be happy to do that. And I'll try and frame this in, I'll try and bring the whole presentation back home with respect to the social determinants of health and the example that I provided in New Orleans with the lower ninth ward and my own experience. As I mentioned, in the lower ninth ward, that industrial canal had been there for, over 50 years before Hurricane Katrina hit. And the canal allowed large ships to pass through. So the air quality in the lower ninth ward was already diminished. So now I'm going to add a fictional scenario on top of what is reality. Let's now imagine that with the cap and trade programs and policies that EDF has supported in the past, a facility comes into the lower ninth ward and says, hey, we're going to build widgets, and our widget factory is going to need so many credits to do this. And there's a place further uptown by the Whole Foods that has been turned into now a beautiful loft set of apartments. And they used to have a factory that had, put out so much environmental pollution. So they buy those credits from that uptown factory. And in the lower ninth ward, you already have a place that's very poor. They don't have the same level of education attainment or even educational opportunity. Let me be very clear that it's not just about attainment, it's about opportunity. You fold that in with now EDF's policies that they've supported, and the air quality is now made even worse. So the overall air quality for Louisiana hasn't gotten worse. The overall air quality for the United States has not gotten worse because we put a cap on it. But a place that was already fraught with a number of environmental challenges and socioeconomic challenges, there's more air pollution that's coming into that community. And we've seen this play out over and over and over again in environmental justice communities. And so EDF really has a lot of work to do in this arena because this is something that we deeply believed in. Another thing that we've done is, EDF comes with a host of very highly educated and respected people. And so when we're trying to solve a problem, we're going to the community or we're going to lower ninth ward and giving someone the solution. We're not engaged in radical listening. We're not engaged in appreciative inquiry. We're not standing still to listen and learn. And, the way that I have described a lot of the different places where we're working is there are community experts. And there are experts who know about water and weather and different changes as it relates to climate that we may not know because we have not lived in that community. And at EDF, we have to begin to respect, not just respect, recognize that their lived experience is just as powerful as someone who has a PhD. And it's just as important to understand that lived experience as it is to respect someone with a PhD. So it's really important to begin to educate ourselves on how we show up. And that comes back to the authentic partnerships, that comes back to the training, because we have made a host of mistakes over the years as an organization. And someone said to me in one of my interviews, well, how would you handle this? And I said, the first thing I would do is apologize. And in part of my 250-person tour or interview, I've apologized to a lot of people about things that I didn't even do. And the next thing that I have to do is now show up with action to say that my apology is not just a set of words, but that it is real and I'm backing it up with action.
Great. I think that is really important for this group to hear, and just how things like cap and trade are able to shift behavior and mitigate climate change, but comes at a cost and it's not good for everybody. And actually, so this leads me to the next question, which I think you already kind of answered to a certain degree, but if there's a smaller nonprofit out there, EDF is a massive organization with a lot of funding. If there's a small group out there and their mandate is to mitigate climate change, they're thinking, I have a small budget, shouldn't I be spending every dollar on the most cost-effective way to mitigate climate change? How do you talk to those smaller groups about why it's important to include environmental justice? And I just want to note that we have about 5 minutes left.
I think it really varies. I think the thing that I've learned in my experience is, where can you make the biggest impact as a smaller group? And I think it will, in terms of climate, it really is going to vary. Like, someone asked me recently, and this, I just came off of a job interview for someone who's applying for a position at EDF. And they asked me, what do you think is the most important thing we should be doing around climate? And I said, the most important thing we should be doing around climate is advocating for voting rights. And they said, what? And I said, advocating for voting rights. Because, what is it? I think 70% of all Black and brown people vote as a bloc for environment. They vote for climate. They vote for candidates who believe in these things. So if you're running a smaller organization, are you partnering with your city council? Are you partnering with the mayor? Who are you working with? Where can you make change? Because change happens up and down a spectrum. Climate is a spectrum and a continuum. And there are a lot of places that are doing, small things that can have major impacts in a community. And these impacts sort of snowball or build upon themselves. So when I'm working with a community like that, it's trying to get them to think creatively, trying to get them to think outside of the box, and trying to get them to understand their power. It troubles me that everyone believes that EDF has so much power and other groups don't. EDF does have power, but we all have power. It's how we choose to use it. And I don't want that to come across as, people are making poor choices, because that's not at all what I'm saying. When I say choose to use it, is begin to think sort of innovatively, just like EDF is going to have to be innovative. It's to some of these smaller groups. Are there things that you can do that are more innovative to address the climate crisis? I get it, you're small, and this problem is massive. So where can you work to have impact based on your own skills and ability?
Excellent. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. I just want to quickly remind everyone that there is another webinar coming up in 1 month's time, how storytelling can change our world, and you can register right now for that at becconference.org. That's going to be fantastic as well, just like today's webinar was fantastic. And I wanted to thank again, Margot, for taking the time out of your extraordinarily busy schedule. Thank you so much for joining us. I just want to bring attention to Marianne Bethel's comment, which I echo, which is thanks so much for echoing the importance of the lived experience. And on behalf of everybody else who joined today, I just wanted to thank you, and we really appreciate the work you're doing, and please keep us updated. This will be recorded, and we'll send you the notes and the slides in your email. So keep posted for that. Margot, do you have anything else you want to add before we go?
I would just like to thank everyone who took time today to participate in the presentation. And I'd like to lean in on your experience and your expertise. So if there's something that I've said that resonated with you, or if there's an article or something that you think would be helpful for me to read, I'm on a path of learning and growth, and I'll be on that path of learning and growth for the rest of my life. And I'd welcome anything that you would like to share that you think would help make this program more durable, or the work that I'm doing more lasting. So I really deeply thank you for the opportunity.
Well, that's very much appreciated. And so how can people reach you, Margot, if they want to send you something?
My email address is at the bottom of the slide deck, and it's the last slide on the slide deck. Please shoot me an email. I tell everyone, and Ruben can attest to this, when the squeaky wheel gets an oil, getting in touch with me is a bit of a nightmare. It is not for a lack of interest, it is for a lack of time. But really, I don't see multiple emails as anyone being a pest. I see multiple emails as I have not gotten back to you. So I deeply welcome the opportunity to learn more from your experiences. Thank you, Ruben.